introduce them. I think they've already been introduced. I think let's jump straight to the meat of it. Deborah, do you want to kick off, or Ron? By dint of seniority.
I could ask you a question. On the spot.
It's clearly age before beauty here. I didn't say age.
Well, it's a difficult task that we've been asked to do, to kind of wrap up a very rich day of offerings of research and prospective research and commentary by so many people who are so well informed about this topic. And also, I have to say, I didn't get much sleep last night, so I'm not sure I'm terribly coherent at this moment. But let me start. The first session, I think, laid out things very nicely with Justin Ifu Lin's keynote address and then the excellent comments on that. And what he pointed out is a theme that's remained with us for the rest of the day, which is that China is changing, and that China's changes and restructuring offers opportunities. And he focused very much on what is possible in the manufacturing sector, how Africa and African countries might be able to grasp some of that. He used his framework of looking at their latent comparative advantage and looking for African countries to look just a little bit further up the scale from where they are right now, and that not every country in Africa is going to be looking at parts of China or sectors in China or particular industries within those sectors that might be relevant, but that some will. And I think the second part of the morning, when we were presenting on manufacturing, we showed how this is happening in some parts of Africa. So there are, of course, controversies about this. I think that even the whole idea about just what governments should do to attract Chinese investment into their countries, what kinds of policies are the most favorable for this, what even the WTO allows in terms of aggressive policies such as local content or forced joint ventures. People brought these issues up, as well as to what possibilities are open for African governments who are interested in taking a developmental approach here. So the first session merged into the second session, I think, at least for me, since it seemed like we were all talking about manufacturing, or quite a bit of it was focused on that. And both what Peter and I talked about in that second session was very much about this normalization, but that normalizing the China-Africa relationship does mean that Africa, the opportunities are not going away, but they're changing. And so we have to, that it's tighter, it's more difficult, and there's competition from around the world. It's not just different parts of Africa that are competing to get these geese to come there, but Asia has an overall advantage in terms of proximity. So some of the questions that were raised during that session were about what kinds of policies really do need to be in place. I touched on that briefly, but one of those questions is about the World Bank's doing business indicators. Some people felt that getting governance right means moving towards more of the World Bank's framework, and others pointed out that China doesn't score so well in this regard. Helen mentioned this later in the day as well. And so what are the actual parts of that will bring manufacturing investment or other kinds of investment to your country? And we still don't really know, I think, enough about those questions. So there's a lot to look at here, and now I'm going to turn it over so that all the other, and all of the best points can, can be made by Romain.
Kindly, yeah. Thank you, Deborah. I thought of approaching the theme a little bit different, in the sense that, because the session was called Priorities for FOCAC, and well, also the closing remarks, I want to raise the question, does FOCAC really matter? Now, obviously, that might be a silly question to ask, just one day ahead of the FOCAC Summit. But what about 3 years down the line, the next FOCAC, FOCAC 7, 8, 9? Is it really, in a sense, from the outside, is still very much perceived as a very high-level kind of event? And as Yushan mentioned earlier, there's this kind of question about finding a balance between more multilateral kind of engagement versus the bilateral. So if you opened a newspaper this morning, you would see that Xi Jinping, he signed about, what was it, I don't have the exact figures in my head, but about $4 billion with Zimbabwe, $1 billion with President Buhari of Nigeria, and about 94, what makes that, in $6.5 US with South Africa. Again, on a very bilateral kind of level. So that kind of makes this question a little bit more significant. Does FOCAC really matter beyond economic kind of sphere? I would say yes, in a certain regard, and I think Dan really put the hammer on the nail in the sense that he talked about this, the shift within the peace and security kind of dimension, which was not really on the agenda before 2012. And it's not necessarily so much of a forward-looking approach, it's still very reactive. They see it's very solution-driven. So they, after Libya in 2011, when they were faced with serious kind of challenges, they needed to make changes. And I think this year, apart from peace and security, this idea of regional integration and industrialization might be high on the agenda, but still it seems from a very esoteric kind of point of view, not necessarily very pragmatic, because what does it mean, regional integration, if you're still engaging mostly from a state-to-state level and not necessarily with the regional economic communities? Admittedly, yes, the role of the AU has increased over the years as well, but there are lots of question marks. And to go back to the conference in itself, I think there was a lot of questions that were raised around, and I'm going to be a geographer now, not only context, but in terms of space, and the idea, the significance of the context, and how a certain number of policies really need to be adopted at different scales and at different levels. But I would add another one. I would say, we didn't really mention it, but it was directly, but it was covered quite extensively, is the notion of time and temporalities. So this idea of space and time at the same, taking together. And again, then also marked, and I agree with this changing approach between an emerging power that has a different approach when it's trying to penetrate a market versus an emerged power already somehow in various countries in Africa, and it tries to sustain its activity. So the challenges that come with it are completely different, and it also, with more citizens, more companies, image, we talked about the issue of branding of images, and very often, although there's a multiplicity of actors who are not directly related, but sometimes in few cases, there's a private engagement and a mishap happening in an activity might directly reflect to the government and vice versa. So it's a very, very complex issue in that regard. And, geez, I can't really read my notes. But I just want to, I think this idea, just to wrap up, that there's FOCAC on the one hand, but there are lots of things happening on a day-to-day basis, and this the China-Africa relations, how they are embodied in people, in ideas, in commodities, in lots of things that go way beyond FOCAC. And I'll leave it at that. Do you want to?
No, stimulated by that. I have to say one more thing about FOCAC. And I do think FOCAC does matter. And I think it matters because it's an event of diplomacy. It's economic and political diplomacy. And so this is important because it provides economies of scale. Roman just mentioned that there were, 3 bilateral announcements this morning, but that's only 3, and they're 3 of the big things that happen. But this provides, it's a 3-year process. It isn't just one conference. It's a 3-year process that allows the Chinese and the African countries to meet regularly and talk about their engagement and what kinds of things might happen. This happens mainly in Beijing, but there are ministerials that happen at a lower level. But I think it's also interesting, you see this happening in other parts of the world. The Chinese have a similar thing in the Caribbean. Again, economies of scale, lots of little countries, and you can just kind of take care of them all with these regular meetings. The South Pacific, it also happens there. But another thing that's interesting is that I was at the FOCAC in 2009, and we had Martin Davies and the Center for Chinese Studies organized a conference also, and there was almost nobody that came to it. But there, we had a bunch of speakers, and we all gave marvelous presentations, and there's almost nobody in the room. And look at the difference here. There's a lot of people. But I want to just find out, how many of you are African? Just raise your hands if you're African. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, it's quite a few. Quite a few South Africans. How many are not South African? And African, yeah. So you're African, and how many Africans not from South Africa?
So the rest of the continent.
Yeah, so there's a very small amount. And how many Chinese? Yeah. 你是中国人。
Before you put him on the spot.
台湾是不是中国一部分? Okay, so it's interesting that it seems like there are a lot of people in this room that aren't either African or Chinese, and so we are interested in FOCAC. So we've come all this way in order to see what's happening here, and I think it's become a kind of a phenomenon to bring us all here, to talk about it and speculate about it and wonder what we'll learn about it around the margins here.
Did you want to say one more thing?
Yeah, one more thing. Sorry, we're going like a battle. No, when I raised the question of the importance of FOCAC, I wanted to tickle your fancy in a little bit, but the idea is just 2 points around. Probably, yeah. Just around the drivers, I think also with the changing economy, there might be the importance of a certain number of drivers might change as the private sector will become more and more predominant on the agenda. And the other thing is also what you just said about who is interested in China-Africa relations. I think also there's slowly, not enough though, but there's a slowly also shift in that regard. I might not make myself too many fans here, but also that there's more and more Africans and Chinese looking into the issue, whereas 10 years ago it was completely dominated by a Western kind of approach, and I think that's also very important in that respect.
Okay, so I think the questions posed. I think the question posed and the discussion we've just had about does FOCAC really matter, I think is very important. And the point that you raised, Deborah, in terms of African and South African interest, I think certainly we can say that there is a significant, I think, South African interest in the China-Africa relationship. I think what the point that Rom has made is also sort of part of an evolution around African think tanks and researchers in the rest of the continent actually beginning to engage on this. And we had earlier this year in February, I think, a very good engagement with a series of other African think tanks from outside of South Africa, as well as, in fact, from the African Union and the African Development Bank on a number of these issues which we have touched on today, including on infrastructure. In fact, there was a separate session on biodiversity and wildlife. Rom helped me here. There was a session on peace and security and migration, of course. And this is, I think, an area where it is important to keep trying to push to gain momentum in terms of stimulating field research in other parts of the continent by Africans as much as it is by organizations and individuals from outside the continent. And I think that there has been, I think, a very interesting shift in that. And certainly compared to, say, 10 years ago or 9 years ago in 2006, where in fact it was the first FOCAC Summit, and we had a conference here in Johannesburg around that, and I think a very different set of actors and participants as a result of that. But I think absolutely, I think you've raised both very important points. I think in the question of does FOCAC really matter, I think it's also useful to consider FOCAC in the broader context of how China's foreign foreign policy is evolving, and the priorities that are becoming more apparent, particularly, I would argue, in the last couple of years. And I suppose as Africans, we should be constantly asking these questions about, how is that changing the relationship, potentially, not necessarily because the relative importance of the relationship might be changing. It doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't continue to be important. And Deborah, you were quoted, and I was playing with my Twitter account, and I see that there was an article in Newsweek that went live, 5 things that China is looking for in Africa, and I think you were quoted on a couple of those. They weren't all your points, but just perhaps to leave you with some of those. I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but using South Africa to access the continent, certainly from a South African perspective, we see ourselves as, I think, in real terms, potentially as a gateway to Southern Africa, but not really to the continent. I think China does pretty well on its own. Building relations with Nigeria, garnering political support, which I think is also part of the point that you made. And certainly as IR people, international relations people, these summits are very important events. This is about diplomacy happening. And so, it's in our interests to encourage them as IR people. And then lastly, and second last point, and I think that was something you also referred to, Deborah, in this set of comments, was tackling regional and international militancy, and particularly issues around, I think, Boko Haram and extremism and so on, which of course for China are particularly important, and they've become increasingly important certainly in the northern and Sahel region of this continent. And of course, lastly, what we have had a lot of in the last couple of days, and no doubt tomorrow and Saturday, handshakes and photo opportunities. But that is very much part and parcel of Summitry, and I think Summitry certainly plays a very important role, and it is about the economies of scale. I remember many, many years ago when the Commonwealth was still an important feature of South Africa's foreign relations. One of the points that kept being brought up was that the Commonwealth was an amazing set of, and I suspect, I'm sure my British colleagues will have something to say about this, but that the Commonwealth was great in that it brought very, very small countries together, the small island states with some of the bigger countries, and this was really an opportunity that was not often found for them to really engage on a whole series of political and economic issues which they might not have otherwise. And I think opportunities such as FOCAC and processes such as FOCAC fulfill that role. But I wasn't supposed to be saying any of this, right? I think my role really was supposed to thank everybody. Yes, and well, before I thank everybody, I have my cues from here. Firstly, please, the evaluation forms, okay? In fact, you will not be allowed to leave unless you fill them in. Secondly, really a very, very big thank you to the ODI and the DEGRP. I think this has been an amazing conference and a great opportunity to partner with you. We've been thrilled. We've learned so much, and I think the exchange has been really critical and very, very important. Specifically, obviously, thank you to Louise Shaxson. I'm now getting tongue-tied. And to the entire ODI team, and I'm probably going to leave people out here, but it's Linda Calabrese, it's Natalie, I wanted to say Nicole, but it's Natalie, I knew it was an N, who's been the comms person and tweeting and retweeting, etc., and then probably a couple of other people who I'm now forgetting, and of course the DEGRP team who has been here and has really provided us with very stimulating presentations and discussions. Then just, of course, to the SAIIA team, to Noema Grobelaar, who was the key interlocutor often on the discussions in the organization, to Aditi Lal Bahadur, to Yushan Wu, to Rudolph, to Sarasa, the people outside, and of course to Hopewell and to Rihanna, our comms team, who've been tweeting and organizing media interviews and who are responsible for the reason that Ross Harvey had to duck out early. But I think the media response has also been very good and extremely positive. And I think that's it from my side. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say something, but for the last one, I just wanted to stand next to Elizabeth so you can get the full glory of our. No, I just really like to thank SAIIA. It's been, I think it's been a tremendous day. I've been following the Twitter sphere, and it's been fantastic. The debates have been amazing. I've learned a huge amount, and I hope that quite a lot of them will be taken forward into the summit. And thank you all very much for sticking with the graveyard shift. Your engagement, your questions, and have a good rest of your time here.